All right, I'll begin. Thank you for being here. I'm Justin Coffey, and the Father Aaron Pembleton Chair in History. I'm talking about 1973, 50 years ago, a retrospective about some of the key events and why it was such a wild year. Okay. That's Life magazine at the end of 1973. Now, in the beginning of the year, in January of 1973, everything seemed all well and good. The economy was strong. The Vietnam War was winding down. All of the protests and the violence that had rent the United States in the late 60s had, for the most part, disappeared. Richard Nixon, who had just come off a tremendous landslide re-election. This is the cover of Time magazine in late January, him taking the oath about some of the issues that Time magazine supposed he would be facing in his second term, though that would change dramatically. There were a couple of things that happened in January, actually in consecutive days. As you see here, this is the January 23rd headline. Lyndon Johnson, 36th president, is dead, was architect of Great Society program. But just beneath that, you see High Court rules abortion's legal in the first 3 months. So Roe versus Wade was decided that day, or January 22nd. Johnson died. And the following headline, the next day, so you had three momentous events. And Nixon wrote in his diary that he was sad to see that Johnson did not live to see the ceasefire accord in Vietnam. So again, in January of 73, everything looks good. There's peace, prosperity. Many people had never even heard of Watergate, and certainly maybe not even of OPEC. By the end of the year, that will have changed dramatically. I just thought I'd get a couple of pictures of early in the year, what was going on. The UCLA basketball team was on its record way to 88 wins. You see Bill Walton there. Lucille Ball had another show on television. And it was just, everything was just kind of typical, normal. Things got a little strange at the Academy Awards, if any of you remember this. This is when Marlon Brando won an award for Best Supporting Actor and sent a Native American up there in protest of something. And turns out she wasn't, we later learned she wasn't actually really even a Native American. But that's, you see there, that's Roger Moore, kind of not knowing what to do with about this. This picture here, I don't know if any of you are from Iowa, but from April 8th to April 10th, 1973, Iowa had its worst recorded snowstorm in history. I don't know if any of you remember that, but the eastern part of Iowa got pounded with a snowstorm. So that's April. And while that was occurring, Nixon's presidency began to unravel. It was in April of 1973 that Nixon's aides some of them, began to tell prosecutors that they were involved in a cover-up of the Watergate break-in and its aftermath. Nixon denied any knowledge or any participation in a cover-up. Then, Monday, April 30th of that year, he went on television. And you see here, he calls for truth, accepts responsibility for Watergate affair. On that night, he announced his top aides, H.R. Haldeman and John Ehrlichman, were resigning. He called them two of the finest public servants I've ever known. He also announced his White House counsel, John Dean, had resigned. You see the picture up on there on the right. He appoints a man, Elliot Richardson, who was serving as Secretary of Defense at the time, to be the new Attorney General. And you see Haldeman and Ehrlichman both out. Now again, in November of 1972, he wins 49 out of 50 states. He gets over 60% of the vote. His approval rating, here, right after the Vietnam Accords, were 68%. By May 1st, his presidency is in trouble. What would begin as something that Gerald Ford would later describe as a long national nightmare. This over a year-long, almost surreal at times, Watergate affair. In May, his top men resign. Again, Nixon denies any involvement in a cover-up, but there's a Senate committee that is probing Nixon's re-election effort. And that man there on the left, who was who? On the left, remember his name? Alexander Butterfield. Alexander Butterfield was one of Nixon's aides who was called before the Senate committee and told the Senate committee and the country, because these hearings were being nationally televised, that Richard Nixon had taped his conversations. Beginning in February of 1971, Nixon began to record all of his conversations in the Oval Office, an office he had in the Executive Office Building, his phone calls, even up at Camp David. Again, Nixon had said he had had no involvement whatsoever in Watergate. Well, now there was a way to find out if that was true. And you see here, Nixon won't release tapes. I thought getting some, I couldn't find anything from the Quincy Herald-Whig, so I got Cedar Rapids, because trying for a local angle. Equates them to papers. This is in July of '73. At the time, Nixon was in the hospital with pneumonia. Conceivably, his presidency was imperiled which would have meant that if he was impeached and convicted or resigned, who would have been president? Know your history. Who would have been president in July of 73? This guy here. Spiro Agnew. I've written a book about him if you're interested. Well, on August 8, 1973, the Wall Street Journal reported that Vice President Spiro Agnew was facing his own investigation. A federal grand jury in Baltimore was investigating political corruption in Maryland. And some witnesses had told the grand jury that they had given kickbacks to Spiro Agnew when he was Baltimore County Executive and Governor of Maryland, and even while he was Vice President of the United States, he was accepting cash envelopes. Agnew held a press conference that day and called these allegations damn lies. And this Time magazine cover, Can Trust Be Restored? If you looked in the background picture, that was a year earlier when Nixon and Agnew were accepting the Republican nomination in 1972. And again, they looked very strong. They won 49 states. And at the time, Spiro Agnew was more popular with conservatives than Ronald Reagan. A year later, they're both under federal investigation. So you now have the possibility of the president possibly being impeached and a vice president possibly being indicted. Somehow things got crazier. October of 1973 is as wild a month as you'll ever find. The special prosecutor investigating Nixon, Archibald Cox, was demanding that Nixon give up the tapes. Nixon was refusing. Agnew's under investigation. And then, out of nowhere, and this was a complete surprise, took everyone by surprise, including the CIA, and most importantly, the Israeli Defense Intelligence Agencies. Several Arab nations attacked Israel during the High Holy Days, Yom Kippur. Again, this was a secret attack. And much of Israel, of course, is shut down because it's Yom Kippur. Within a couple of days, the future of Israel looks to be almost in doubt. Then on October 10th, as you see, Spiro Agnew resigned after pledging just 2 weeks earlier that he would not resign if indicted. And you see below, huge tank battle rages at Suez, the Suez Canal, because Egypt was part of the force invading Israel. Egypt had lost the Sinai Peninsula in the Six-Day War in 1967. They were hoping to get it back and were joined by several other Arab nations. On October 12th, Gerald Ford is nominated to be Spiro Agnew's successor. And in the meanwhile, Nixon authorizes large-scale military aid to Israel. He tells the military aid, just send whatever you can. And this tips the balance. Well, by the early 1970s, the United States has a problem. It's beginning to import more oil than it has domestically. And this is, of course, an even bigger problem in Western Europe. It doesn't have any oil. In response to the United States' support of Israel, OPEC, which is dominated by Saudi Arabia, announces an embargo, an oil embargo against the United States. What time do I go? Is it 2 or 2:30?
You still got plenty of time. You still got like 15 minutes or so.
Okay. Overnight prices rise. Then, on Saturday night, October 20th, Nixon has his press secretary announce that he has fired the special prosecutor who was subpoenaing Nixon's tapes. Problem was, Elliot Richardson, the attorney general, wouldn't fire the special prosecutor, so Nixon fired him too. And then Richardson's deputy, William Ruckelshaus, wouldn't do it either, so Nixon fired him. So along came the Solicitor General, who was a man named Robert Bork, who fired them all. This became known as the Saturday Night Massacre. Nixon's approval ratings by this time are in the 30s and dropping into the 20s. Within a week after the Saturday Night Massacre, a committee is formed in the House, or a vote is formed to form a committee to study impeachment charges against Nixon. Again, 10 months earlier, January 20th, 1973, Nixon took office. He had had a remarkably successful first term. Going to China, visiting the Soviet Union, an arms control agreement, the economy was strong. There were all these riots and dislocation in the 60s, those had ended. He'd done a lot of things domestically. And again, if you look at this photo, there's no OPEC, there's no Watergate, nothing. No one saw this coming. In November of '73, Nixon has a press conference at Disney World in Florida, where he tells the country, "I'm not a crook." By that time, the majority of Americans come around to disagree. And then, we're facing a very moderate winter right now. We just have not had, in the Midwest, much snow or cold. Well, beginning in November and going through February, much of the United States faced a very Cold snap. And New York had record cold in December of 73. A lot of houses back then were fueled by what for heat? By, if you remember, people would drive up to their house and you put gas in there. Well, there isn't. There's a shortage of oil. And by November of 1973, you're seeing signs like no gas or like this all across the country. I deliberately chose that photo because of the Volkswagen. Because beginning in 1974, millions of Americans begin to buy German and Japanese cars because they get such better gas mileage than American cars, which creates this terrible economic crisis. The picture on the left is December 23rd, 1973, in New York City. You see cars lining up because they found out that gas station had gas. The Time magazine, again, is a takeoff on All in the Family. You see Nixon's energy cuts, and again, you get this brutally cold winter that people are just not prepared for. I mean, we obviously in the last 2 years have paid higher energy costs. They had no way to offset it. I mean, when oil prices jumped 350%, in the summer of 1973, a barrel of oil was selling for $3. By December of 1973, it's $12. You get a terrible shock. So that was 50 years ago. I'll happy to take any questions. Yes.
I remember 1973 very well, the year I graduated from high school. And as an 18-year-old, I was less interested in politics than in the relationship between men and women. And two things happened in the fall of 73. One was the release of the movie Last Tango in Paris, which pushed the limits of what can be shown in film. The other was the tennis match between Billie Jean King and Bobby Riggs,
Yes.
which was the battle of the sexes.
Right.
And it began the women's, in my mind, as an 18-year-old, the women's liberation movement.
That's a good point. Yes. Yes. There's a good movie about the Riggs match. It came out a couple of years ago. Other? Yes.
What about kickbacks? How does that compare with what's going on now?
Well,
I mean, they don't call them kickbacks, but I'm sure they're,
see, the thing is, Agnew was just stupid enough to actually take cash envelopes.
Yeah.
And he would take a contractor, when he was governor of Maryland, would give him $10,000 in cash. Agnew would then put $10,000 in cash in the bank the next day. It made it very easy for prosecutors to say, hey, we see you met with this guy. He claims he gave you $10,000. The next day, you put $10,000 in your bank account. You know, it was interesting. I remember talking with Governor Jim Thompson, who helped prosecute Agnew. And he said that there were 4 states where corruption and graft just went hand in hand, and no one, this is just the way things were done. If you wanted a building contract, you wanted a road contract, you wanted to build a bridge, you paid people off. He said the 4 states were Louisiana, New Jersey, Maryland, and Illinois. Yeah.
mentioned Bork, I didn't know about him.
Yeah,
Did it have any impact
Yes.
on why he was
Yes.
rejected as a Supreme Court
yes,
later on?
yes. In fact, Ted Kennedy was very close. Ted Kennedy was very close with Archibald Cox, who was fired. Cox had been John Kennedy's Solicitor General, the same position that Bork was when he fired Cox. So yes, there was a certain amount of retribution, vengeance involved. Yes, that did play a role. Yep. Bork always said, I don't call it the Saturday Night Massacre, I refer to it as the events of October 20th, 1973. There was a World Series, or I think it was the A's and the Reds in the World Series, and they got in a fight that day. I mean, someone slid into second base like really hard, and a fight broke out. Other questions? Well, thank you for having me.
you join the Quincy Museum Board? You've been nominated.
Okay. We're not going to mess up. Okay. As has been advertised, I'm Father Joe Zimmerman. I've been asked to speak to you about the history of Quincy University. First, let me say a word or two about my own history at QU. I'm listed as a graduate of the class of 1959. I did not set foot in Quincy until 1963. Our Franciscan province had us studying in Cleveland, Ohio, but since the province owned QC, they arranged for us to get college credit through Quincy University, through Quincy College, and be listed as graduates from here, even though we never lived here. And then in 1963, 63, and 64, I spent the year across the street at St. Francis Parish doing an internship in pastoral work. And as the year drew to a close, the province asked me to get ready to teach sociology at Quincy College, go to Father Gabriel Brinkman, who was about to become president of the college at that time. He had a doctorate from Catholic U in sociology, and he had taught me in Cleveland in a psychology course a couple years earlier. They told me he would tell me where to go, and he says, go to Harvard. Well, sure, I said. I wrote for a summer school catalog. About 2 weeks later, I'm in Cambridge, Massachusetts, on campus. And I spent the next several years working on a degree in sociology, wasting too much time on other stuff. And finally, in January of '70, I returned here to begin teaching, and I've been here ever since. Feel free to interrupt me with questions if you have any, or comments as I go along. So I use a script here because sometimes when I go off into the stratosphere if I don't discipline myself with something. Quincy College, or Quincy College, began as because the pastor of a German-speaking parish here in town, St. Boniface, wanted a school for his boys. And he begot 3 friars from Germany, and they began teaching in this 3-story building at 8th and Main, which you see on the screen there. 2 of the 3 didn't speak English. And there were about 50 students in the group, and friars lived on the 2nd floor. I think they had a chapel on the 3rd floor, and the students were on the 1st floor. They studied there, took classes there. The unspoken mission statement of the school throughout its history has been, we take students where they're at, try to help them improve wherever they're at. We could care less about looking good in the statistics. You know, some schools recruit students who could probably succeed no matter what the school did, and some schools recruit less prepared students and then brag about the number that they flunk out, which is not us. The friars spent only a year or 2 at 8th and Main. Then they moved to the orphanage at 20th and College. The St. Aloysius Orphan Society, which had been formed because, I believe, of a cholera epidemic. A lot of children were without parents. And so they built this orphanage on 20th and College. It's in the southeastern corner of what we call the athletic field now, the field out there. So they began to, they moved there and started teaching some rooms in that building. And then after a couple of years, they moved to, I mentioned that they called it St. Francis Solanus College. And you know, of course, the parish across the street is St. Francis Solanus Parish. Francis Solanus was a friar who did mission work among indigenous people in Peru. I suspect that the friars who named the school and the parish thought that the entire Midwest was populated by indigenous people. And this is a statue of St. Francis Solanus above the main entrance of Francis Hall. If you look up, you'll find it there. Father Tom Brown, who's responsible for the artwork in the Quincy College Chapel, painted him with a violin, probably a better portrayal. We've learned that baptizing people doesn't automatically make them Christians, but music can make most people better Christians and better human beings. So his painting is now on the wall of the music department area of the North Campus. So they taught for a few years in the grade school, which was on the corner of 18th and College, where the west end of Francis Hall is now. In 1917, the friars renamed the college Quincy College and Seminary. The word seminary was added because the First World War was putting some of the students studying for the priesthood, I guess, in danger with the draft, and so they used the term seminary, which got dropped fairly quickly. And it stayed that way until 1992, when Father James Toll renamed it Quincy University. Am I moving away from this mic too much? Okay. Just want to make sure people can hear me. In 1865, a friar came to the college who shaped its existence for the next 40 years. His name was Father Anselm Mueller. Father Francis Jerome Gray wrote his own history of Quincy College. And the early chapters of that history are very fine. He did a lot of thorough research to do that. And when I was working on my own history of the college 10 years ago, we were tempted to put a CD version of Father Francis Jerome's history in a pocket in the back of my version, but that didn't get done. But we call him FJ. He was better with the earlier years than with the more recent years. And maybe I'm in the same boat. You know, I've lived into this earlier stuff more, and the last 10 years I haven't really been involved in the college that much, so I can talk more about early years than recent ones. Father Francis Jerome says of Father Anselm, he quotes him, "This is a monarchy and I am the monarch." And he's the one who built the east wing of Francis Hall now, in 1871. Here are two pictures of what it looked like then. Behind the building, kind of to the left and behind it, was an old friary. That's where the friars lived. And this, of course, front wing is still standing, minus its little steeple on top. Here's what a reporter from the Quincy Herald said about that building. The basement contained the boiler room, the bakery, billiard tables, and the gymnasium. And what people meant by gymnasium in those years is not what we think of a gymnasium now. I think we would call it like an exercise room. The second floor study hall had 100 cherry wood desks. The third floor contained the chapel, sacristy, infirmary, and a jail for boys who misbehaved. That jail was apparently connected to Father Anselm's office, and I think I know where it was. I got here just before they demolished that wing, which I'll talk about in a moment. The fourth floor, there were 2 dormitories with private rooms for prefects. The school had its own water supply with a large, huge water tank on the roof, cleverly concealed by a wooden latticework steeple. So that's what the steeple was doing on top of the building. And I guess when they didn't need the water supply anymore, they took off the steeple. As the city only provided fire protection to buildings west of 14th Street, the friars and the boys organized their own fire department and held drills to prepare for that danger. In 1892, a new president took over, Father Nicholas Leonard. He built the rest of Francis Hall and a wing on the east side that was demolished in the 1980s. Oh, this is another picture of the first building. This is the wing that was demolished. I'm sure a lot of you remember it. In some ways, it's more interesting than the rest of Francis Hall. It began as a study hall on the first floor and an auditorium on the second floor. This is the study hall. And I studied in the seminary outside Chicago in exactly the same environment. This was a German tradition. And on the side, you can see a little alcove up there where the proctor sat. And his job was to make sure the students do not misbehave while you're studying. And it extended to the point that you were not even to read fiction books. You were supposed to be studying your textbooks and doing other things, not writing letters home. You had 2 periods a week when we could write letters home and read fiction books. Above the study hall, there was an auditorium. Unfortunately, I had a disaster this morning. I had this all ready. I was transferring it to my little flash drive, and something happened, and I lost the whole thing. So I had to go back and recreate the pictures. I couldn't find where some of the pictures were, where I got them. So I had a picture, which wasn't very good, of a stage. There's a fine picture somewhere of the seating in that auditorium. It's there's a little plaque at the entrance to Francis Hall by the door commemorating the time that John Philip Sousa performed in that auditorium. So that's the claim to fame for that building. By the time I got here in 1970, there was an engineering report that said the auditorium could not be used. It was unsafe to put a big crowd of people up there. So the dining room below it, the study hall area below it had been divided into classrooms on the side facing the athletic field. I taught in one of them. It was a grim place, and the whole building was pretty grim. And then the other side was the library. Oh, I'm sorry. This was the library. That's the same room you saw a minute ago that was filled with desks. Now there's a partition in the middle, which put classrooms on the right side and library on the left. This was the students' dining room in the college. That is what's now the president's office and the registrar's office. When I came here, of course, the tables and chairs were all gone. It was a meeting room called the Old Social Hall. And by the time I got here, of course, the library had been moved to the new library. That area was empty, so we called that the new Old Social Hall, or the new Old Social Hall. Things went along quietly from the early days until the 1930s with a student body of around 200. Until the 1930s, the school was basically a high school with 2 years of college attached. At some point in there, they got accreditation from the state of Illinois. Well, actually, they got a charter in 1873. I'm not sure. That might have been just for the whole institution. I think they got accredited as a junior college in the 30s. The high school was called the Quincy College Academy. They had admitted the first woman in 1922. I think it was a sister, a nun. And 10 years later, Father Vincent Fochman opened enrollment to any woman. So we've had women on campus since the 30s. Here's Father Francis Jerome describing how the college got through the Depression. The monotonous and poor fare served in the boarders' dining room at the west end of the first floor has become a legend. Father Vincent bought whatever was on sale or in season. For example, apples served 3 times a day every conceivable way. The sisters who were cooking departed, and Father Vincent had to hire women to cook. A case of rotten eggs and sacks of wormy flour are still remembered. One young man became so tired of bologna all the time that he had tacked a slice to the president's door. The credit of the college was no good. No tradesman would leave his product here without cash payment. There was no fuel to heat the chapel in the winter, so they put a glass partition across the back of the chapel, and the friars prayed behind the partition there, a partition where they could get some heat. There were 2 radiators in it. But Mass had to be said out in the cold in the bigger chapel. The water turned into ice before the liturgy was completed. Father Vincent would accept almost anything in lieu of tuition, coal or produce or labor from students. Now, in the late 1930s, a decision had to be made about whether to keep both the college and the high school. This is a graph of the enrollment of the 2. The academy, which was what the high school was called, is the darker line, and the lighter line is the college. They kind of went up and down. But in 1939, this is FJ's description again. In 1939, Father Provincial Vincent Schrempp decided to close the college and keep the academy. Father John Kebele, who was in charge of the school, he was determined to oppose the provincial. In a secret meeting held all day in the college library, with paper pasted on the door to prevent any news leaks, Father John set out to convince the faculty, who was almost all friars, that the high school was not viable. The college was supporting the high school, not vice versa. Now, Father Alois had persuaded the pastors to subsidize the tuition of their high school boys. Father Alois was the boss of the college. But now they were unable to do so. Only St. Boniface and St. Francis paid for their young men. So this meeting was a stormy one. The high school had its defenders. However, Father John's figures did not lie. The high school had to go. I'm continuing Father FJ's description. Only someone of Father John Kebele's immovable personality would have withstood the criticism aimed at him. The Catholics of Quincy accused him of destroying the education of their sons after 80 years of success. Why did such a step have to be taken now? The pastors were angry. What provision could be made for the future of their boys? Father Provincial Vincent was angry. He would have to reverse his decision to close the college. He had been the pastor of St. Francis in Quincy for 6 years. He thought he had sized up the situation correctly. Bishop Griffin in Springfield was furious. He even refused to pay for his own seminarians while they were in high school. Instead, he sent his boys to the Route College High School in Jacksonville, where they had an endowment that paid all the expenses. Bishop Griffin offered to give to the college St. Aloysius Orphanage, and FJ, in parentheses, it was not his to give. That small building, designed for a few dozen little ones, was totally unsuitable. The bishop said he meant to close it anyway because he had a large, splendid orphanage in Alton. The crisis was settled by sending the boys to Notre Dame Academy for girls, and the school sisters refused to accept the boys until the local pastors paid for them to remodel the school, to which they added a gymnasium. I guess that's the CYO gym, I'm not sure, but this caused Notre Dame High School on 8th and Broadway, which had been a girls' school, to become co-ed, and it remained that way until about 1959 when the Christian Brothers opened Christian Brothers High School in the building that's now Quincy Notre Dame. I taught religion there for a semester in 1964. just to describe the experience. Every class began with the Our Father, Hail Mary, Glory Be, Apostles' Creed, and 3 decades of the Rosary, ending with the prayer, St. John Baptist de La Salle, pray for us. And I was grateful. It killed 10 minutes of the class, and I didn't have to study it. The Christian Brothers left, and they were replaced by the Servite Order, and it was renamed Catholic Boys High School so they could keep the CB initials. And then around 1975 or so, the Notre Dame sisters moved the girls into the CB building, and most of the Notre Dame building was demolished. Chapel is still standing, and you can see it there in the corner of 7th and Vermont. Back to Quincy College. During the Second World War, most male students were gone, and the college survived with about 50 women, mostly sisters. And a lot of them weren't on campus because a lot of them were sisters studying nursing in Springfield at St. John's School of Nursing or at St. Mary's Hospital School of Nursing here in Quincy. After the war, I think I got a graph here. Oh, never mind. After the war, the GI Bill, so-called, paid college tuition for war veterans, provided they were white, and enrollment exploded. For the first time, the school had to hire a number of lay faculty in greater numbers. They always had 1 or 2 lay faculty on the staff, but they got a lot more. They had a row of war surplus buildings, which are pictured here on 20th and Chestnut, where Heline Hall is now standing. And the one on the corner of 16th and Main, now the Quincy Museum, that was called Stillwell Hall, and women lived there. Further east along the block, there was another mansion called Bonfoy Hall. And after QC no longer needed the building, George Irwin moved in and made it his home until he died. And I was in the seminary in those years, and we entertained dreams about being sent to Quincy for the summer to study, but Bonfoy had a swimming pool. That would have been a real draw. Father Julian Woods became president in 1954 and put his stamp on the college. He abolished fraternities and sororities. The story was he abolished football in the middle of the football season. He definitely abolished football, but I forget exactly how that happened. He hired a music professor named Laverne Wagner, who led the music program until 1983. At that time, the college declared financial exigency and terminated his tenured position. He was very angry, and he self-published a book called The True History of Quincy University. We have a copy, which I show to people. Keep it on the shelf next to mine. Father John Doctor enjoys, well, I'm not sure he enjoys it. He's referred to in a footnote in the book, and he's quoting one of Laverne's sons as saying that could never imagine that John Doctor would become a provincial. Father Julian went on to leave the order and priesthood and get married. For years, that small residence hall west of Garner had been called the Married Students' Dorm. It housed married students and some faculty. Then suddenly, about 20 years ago, a sign appeared on the building, Woods Hall. There was never any celebration of the naming or any explanation of where that name came from. So I never did hear why or how that came about. Enrollment at QC increased continuously through the 40s, 50s, and 60s up until the early 70s. In the 1960s, college education was a way to postpone the military draft imposed during the Vietnam War. And when that war began winding down in the early 70s, the enrollment began dropping. By 1948, it was decided that Father Henry Freiberg should become the next Quincy College president, and a change was made. And that's that time they made their first attempts to get accreditation from the North Central Association of Colleges and Universities. They tried 3 times and finally got it in 1953. One little feature of this is the sister formation movement. Many of these hundreds of groups of sisters in the country had been organized in the 19th century by priests or bishops to respond to needs in a particular area. Some priest or bishop would recruit a number of young women to teach in a school and then form a religious order. And often they designed these strange habits or garb for them. But, since elementary teachers in most American schools before 1930 were women expected to be celibate, the system didn't differ greatly from secular American culture. In fact, religious women enjoyed advantages not shared by their secular counterparts. They received social support as members of religious communities, and they benefited from official church approval for their work. But the ad hoc origins of many of these communities meant that girls were sometimes sent out to teach as soon as they graduated from high school. Now, beginning in the 30s and 40s, they began to make efforts to provide better education for these women. And the movement acquired the name the Sister Formation Movement, and it gathered momentum into the 50s. And Quincy College participated in it by organizing what they called vocational institutes for sisters. And I had a picture of that which I couldn't locate. Another blank slide here. Okay. The sisters here, the names of hundreds of sisters appear on the list of students enrolled here. And these sisters, like the friars, when we were in Cleveland, they never saw Quincy, but they're listed as official students, so their work could be reflected on college transcripts. Then I've got a little section here about African Americans at Quincy College. The Franciscans of our province have not always been in the forefront of efforts to overcome racial discrimination. When Father Tolton wanted to get an education, the Franciscan seminary wouldn't accept him any more than the Dawson seminaries in the country. And as you know, he had to go to Rome to get his priestly training. But eventually, starting in the 30s, the province began to work with black Catholics in Chicago at Corpus Christi, and by the late 40s, black candidates were being admitted to our seminaries. Probably our first black students here were members of athletic teams. Now, Kevin Steinkamp, who worked here, and he has a picture. His father played on the football team, and he showed me a picture of that team, and there's a black player on the team. And the Falcon described a black player named Earl Lefty Johnson, quote, Negro speedster and the thrower of long passes. In the early 50s, Quincy College's basketball coach, Harry Forrester, welcomed black players to his team, and with them they quietly fought discrimination wherever his team faced it, on or off the court. One time the whole team walked out of a restaurant when they were not going to serve his black players. In April 2005, several members of that team, along with Coach Forrester, returned to Quincy to recall their experiences. The Herald Whig commemorated that, had a special section of the paper with the title, Only the Net Was White, describing how the team became the first Quincy College team to reach the NAIA National Tournament. Here's the Whig article saying, racism, discrimination, and segregation followed us around, said Ed Sylvester, 69, a sophomore on the 1954-55 team. Where to stay during our travels, where to eat. We were not even welcomed at the movies. We could not use certain restrooms. It was appalling. Opposing fans constantly yelled at and threatened the players. The N-word bombarded their every movement. Referees' whistles often sounded an extraordinary number of fouls on the Quincy players. And this Bester is saying again, in my 4 years at Quincy College, we didn't play against a total of 5 black players because many of America's colleges and universities would not even recruit African American athletes. The rationale for that was that they weren't good enough, they wouldn't be as good enough athletes to compete with white athletes, so they were not to be allowed to play. Okay, Father Henry Freiberg was president in the late 40s. He brought football back to the campus after the war, organized the Pioneer Conference, composing of McKendree, Shurtleff, Eureka, and Quincy. And the fall of 1951 saw one of those blow-ups that fatally wound a presidency. Several football players violated disciplinary rules by failing to return to campus on time after the homecoming weekend. The Dean of Men, Father Everest Farnand, an inexperienced disciplinarian only recently appointed to the job, suspending them from playing the next 2 games, causing the team to lose those games. The football coach was outraged and resigned. The Associated Press distributed a story nationwide about QC as a college where the Dean of Men ran the football program. Father Henry stood loyally by his dean, taking the heat, causing his relations with everyone else to deteriorate. Some of the friar faculty refused to speak with him. And then the second thing that sealed his doom as the president was he tried a couple of times to get accreditation from North Central, but he wasn't an academic. His experience was in parish work, and he kind of blew it with North Central, so he was gone. And then came Father Julian Woods, who, as I mentioned earlier, hired Laverne Wagner and ran the school in the 50s. Father Francis Jerome describes Father Julian as gifted but autocratic. He ran the college as a one-man show, gradually arousing opposition among the friars and lay faculty. During his tenure, enrollment passed the 1,000 mark, and the size of the faculty increased from around 20 to between 50 and 60. The number of friars went from a steady level of 15, which had been true since 1900, to a new level between 30 and 40 friars. So in the late 40s, the province was ordaining a huge number of men. There were large classes that actually entered the order in the early 40s during the war, and they really had a major role in the next half century of the college. That included people like Father Gabriel and a bunch of the others. How are we doing for time here? So I've got a bunch of pictures of former faculty that I would like to show you if we get time to do that. So I could go on and on with this sort of thing. Mentioned Augustine Hall, 1958, I believe. Father Augustine Sapinski was the Minister General of the Franciscan Order in Rome. He came here to visit, and so in honor of him, they named it Augustine Hall. This was a one-story residence hall that went all the way from 18th to 17th Street on the north side of Elm, just north of the parish. And it was because it was one story, students could escape at any time through the windows of their rooms. This annoyed Father Gabriel, and when he built Padua Hall, he made sure that there were no student rooms on the first floor, and furthermore, the rooms did not face another room across the corridor because that was a distraction. And the building was also very noisy, I understand. So eventually, it got demolished. And all the rest of the residence halls were built with government loans. Padua, Heline, Garner, probably the married students, it's now called Willer Hall, Lynn Street, and the only and even the Friary, those were all built with government loans. The Friary was labeled a faculty house, had a little sign on it with that name. I think Father Gabriel tried to sneak the Friary choir past the government, claim it was a library, and the woman in charge says, "You're not fooling us. That's not a library, that's a chapel. We're not paying for it." So the province had to pay for the Friary choir there. Okay. Father Gabriel's first term, growth in enrollment continued, and with it the growth of the number of lay faculty and staff. Okay. The most visible change after Vatican II was that the friars, with a few exceptions, began to wear secular clothing, abandoning the brown Franciscan robe, which they called a habit, until then they'd worn it all the time. It was seen as a way of returning to the roots of the Franciscan movement, with the argument that the traditional garb of ordinary working people is what Francis wore in his day. So I wore this gray blazer and felt stupid in it, but I never felt comfortable wearing any kind of jacket. I got as far as a tie and a cardigan. That's about as far as I could go. Anyway, Father Gabriel had a great first term. Enrollment really boomed. He built all these buildings. And they brought in soccer in the 60s. And Paul can tell you more about that than I can. And so we rose to national prominence. We earned the NAIA national title in soccer several times in the 70s and 80s. Another innovation they did was to end the first semester at Christmas, and most colleges used to go into January. In fact, everything I was involved in up to that time had the first semester ending at the end of January. And so, got a section here, really kind of cheating using my old history. Oh, this is a picture of the first computer at Quincy College. You can see on the side of it, there's a little white strip. It's really like a teletype machine. There was a strip of paper that this machine punched holes in, and that paper would be read into the phone lines to Chicago, to IIT, which had the actual computer. And then it would process the data, send it back here. Next, they got a connection to the University of Iowa in Iowa City, and then we still had cards at that time. You had and this was true when I was in grad school, you had to type your program on these Hollerith cards, IBM cards. If you made a mistake, you had to take the card out and replace it. So you would submit your deck of cards in the afternoon, wait overnight for the run to be done, and then the next morning you'd come back and find out there was a fatal error somewhere. You have to figure out where the error was, take the card out, replace it, put the deck end back in, and then get another run overnight. Well, then they got a terminal, so they had terminals here that you could type directly into Iowa, and that made things a lot better. But for a long time, the actual computer was in Iowa City, and the results got sent back here. Got a section on McHugh Theater. Got his picture later, Hugh Fitzgerald. He was like a parent. He required food and drinks to be left outside, and he policed the entrance. I was present when Hugh Fitzgerald got into a shouting match with Dr. Kuna, because Dr. Kuna was involved in a medical emergency and came late, and he insisted he be allowed to come into the theater, and Hugh did not let him go in. An important thing in the 70s was the John Wood Community College venture. The state of Illinois mandated that every place in the state had to be in a community college district. So they formed a district, which they named after John Wood, and they decided that here they would not have a separate faculty. They would create an administration and hire faculty from Quincy College, Culver Stockton, Hannibal LaGrange, and a couple more, Gem City Business College and so on. And they would teach the classes, and the administration would be the John Woods, which meant that you would have community college students in your classroom. Now we didn't know who was QC and who was John Woods. But I did a study one time of comparison of grade point averages of the two, because the charge was made that these John Wood students were pulling down the quality of Quincy College students. classrooms. Well, they had about the same grade point average, the two groups of students, but the standard deviation was bigger for John Wood, which led me to believe that John Wood had two separate populations. They had a population of older students who were serious about education and getting good grades, and a population of younger students just out of high school who didn't appreciate what they were getting and were blowing off their college education and getting poor grades. And I think that's what happened. But eventually both administrations decided to terminate the agreement in the mid-1980s. By 1990, the last John Wood students had left here. I think I have here's the picture of the enrollment. The red part is the John Wood students in the college. You can see around 1983, there were about an equal number of John Wood and Quincy College students on campus. Father Gabriel's second term, which began in 1976, was not as successful as his first. He did not want to fire anybody, and as the enrollment dropped, we had too many faculty. And so by the time his term ended, we were approaching financial disaster. So Father James Toll was hired from New York, and he came in and immediately, among other things, he tore down that building that we described there that had problems architecturally. And then he declared financial exigency and eliminated a bunch of tenured faculty. It's a very painful kind of thing to go through. I only survived because Father Gabriel decided not to return to the sociology program. If he had wanted to come back and teach sociology from being president, I would have had to move somewhere else. But he left here and went to take on the Franciscan Press in Chicago. Okay. In 1970, right around 1970, they formed the first lay board of trustees. Until 1970, the college was basically run by the Franciscans. I thought it was the provincial council in St. Louis was the board of the college. Something I found in my own history suggested it was friars here that were on the board. There were always two friars on the board of trustees until James Toll came along and said that doesn't work because you're on the board, you're hiring the president, and the president's ordering you around. That's not tenable. So after that, no friars were anymore on the board. No faculty members were on the board. There's still 5 friars on the board. But anyway, that separated the two systems. And as part of that, before that time, the finances were not separate either. Money came in from tuition or wherever else, and they ran the school from that. Now, with the coming of a whole separate organization, then they started assigning salaries to the friars in commensurate to their academic rank. And then they would, when it started in 70, they would write they write a single check to the friary for all the friars, because we don't have individual checking accounts. And then the friary would donate half of it back to the college as contributed services. And that went on for some years, and as the number of friars decreased, we had to reduce that percentage. At one point it was 30%, and then finally they phased it out. It had 2 bad effects. One was it caused the university not to take fundraising seriously enough. They said the friars are our endowment, and which they were in a way, but when the friars left, they hadn't built up a tradition of an alumni donating to the college. And the other was that I think it kind of gave the friars a little bit of a edge in policy and stuff. He who pays the piper plays the tune, so if you're donating stuff, then you can call the shots. That causes resentment. Let me move on to my pictures of friars here. This is Bob Blaisdell. You may remember him. He was my colleague for 30 years in sociology. When I first came, he and I shared the office. We once had a student climb through the transom to get into our office to get stuff. I don't know how he got up there. The old rooms had transoms above the door, so you could lock your door but get some air through. Anyway, they all said he was terribly boring, but he taught a huge number of students and taught criminal justice and social work and everything. And this is Dave Costigan, our history professor, still around. Got his doctorate after he began teaching here. He came here in the 50s to coach baseball, I think, taught some history, and then he got his doctorate finally at the university in Bloomington. What is that called? Illinois State, I guess. And he won an award for the dissertation. I think it dealt with Quincy during the Civil War. Here's Hugh Fitzgerald on the right, Father Francis Jerome on the left. Hugh had his office down below in that little room off the entryway to the theater. And that was his kingdom down there. And Francis Jerome was legendary for all kinds of stories. This is Louis Margaglione. Did I miss anybody? No, that's right. Okay. Music teacher, he. I heard recently he's living in Texas, I think, but he's still around. One of the last faculty to leave here from my day. Joe Messina, he taught English. I don't know why math is above his head, but and he's still around. He's in Texas right now. He and I and his wife, Mary Ann Klein, get together regularly for writing sessions. Father Owen Bloom, who taught history for years, expert in Peter Damian. He's a medieval religious, not one of my favorite people. Had a lot to do with pushing the cause of clerical celibacy in the church. But Owen seized upon him as a research subject and wrote him all the way till retirement. George Schneider taught biology here, still around. He's Father John Ostick's brother-in-law. Father John's sister and George live out in Liberty. And he was an expert in birds. Talked about being hired by the state to go through Siloam Springs State Park. He had a plotted direction, got to walk straight, regardless of the terrain, stop every so often and listen for birds and record what he heard, and then work another 15 yards and stop again and record, and did things like that. Charlie Winking, music department, the choral stuff. I still remember him pushing Scott Joplin and the Little Red Book when that first came out in the 70s. That was a big thing, and he was very excited about that. Father Tom Brown, the friar who redid the chapel decorations and a lot of other stuff. Joe Emeka, mathematics professor from Nigeria. When he died, he and I kind of got to know each other because for a brief period in the late 90s, Father Eugene Cole asked me to be VP for academics, and I foolishly said yes. And then a couple years later, Joe Emeka was asked to be VP for academics, and he foolishly said yes. And we ended up going to a conference together in Atlanta. So we saw Martin Luther King's tomb and all kinds of other stuff. But when he died, I went to his family brought me to St. Louis. He was much more African than I appreciated. The whole outfit there was in dashikis, and we had special stoles with kente cloth, and so it was very much an African thing. So, Father Phil Habing, our folklorist, two big things in his life: folklore, stories from around this area, and philosophy for children. He somehow got hooked up with somebody that was a movement for philosophy for children, and he claimed that was the best way to really get kids to think, teach them philosophy early. And he actually put it into practice, I think, in St. Anthony's School. And he had one trio of young men that all became quite successful that he was very proud of. Bob Major, who's still here, doing art, and does this artwork that I fail to appreciate, but they say it's he wins awards and gives exhibits all over the country. Bill Postilione, political science. Hugh Sebbing, I'm going to end with him. He's in a wheelchair, and he led the jazz band from the wheelchair. And one of my last slides here has to do with Solano Hall. This is the orphanage that replaced the original one that I showed you at the beginning of my program. On the south side of college, they built this building as an orphanage. And then in 1946, the college bought it. It became a student dormitory for a while. And then they put their music department over there. And so Hugh was there, and you can see from the back side, if you look on the ground floor, there's a little dark brown door there. That was a home-built elevator for Hugh's wheelchair. So they constructed a little elevator that boosted him up to the first and second floors of the building so he could do his music there. It's a fine example, I think, of a tradition here that you take people where they're at and you try to work with them. If they got a disability, work around it. And that's all I have to say right now. So. Yes, Joe?